Beth, thank you. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, there summarising what the Prime Minister has had to say in the Commons today, and of course a response from the opposition leader. Beth, thank you.
Personal determination to make the legacy of Grenfell Tower one of the defining changes to the country I want to make as Prime Minister, to the families, the survivors, the immediate community. He said, we will support you now and always, especially those that were children in the memory of your loved ones. He said, we will deliver a generational shift in the safety and quality of housing for everyone in this country. So tonally, profoundly sorry, acknowledging the tragedy for those families that were let down by the government. The Prime Minister saying it is the duty of a country, first and foremost, to keep its citizens safe, and it failed. And then, yes, he then went on to say this cannot just be about words, it has to be about actions. The Prime Minister said that the government will now look at all 58 recommendations in Sir Martin's inquiry report. He said there will be debate on the floor of the House. We will respond to in full to the inquiry's recommendations within 6 months. We will update Parliament annually on our progress against every commitment that we make. He also noted the fire in Dagenham last week. Fortunately, no one was killed in that. And he said the fact is that there is still unsafe cladding, and he pledged to speed up the processes in which this cladding was dealt with. And he said he would bring forward more details on that too in the autumn. So, Prime Minister trying to somehow acknowledge and answer the unanswerable, really, for those victims, and trying to set out an apology to at least acknowledge the failings as families looked on in the Commons. They're in the public gallery watching this statement, but very sincerely and clearly saying that this is not just about words, that there will be recommendations brought forward and implemented in the autumn, beginning from the autumn.
Beth, it's also worth remarking on the fact that the Prime Minister did strike a note of caution today, saying, of course, that now the report is out, there is the hope from survivors and families affected that whatever's in that report may yet lead to prosecutions, whether that be of organisations or individuals. And he did strike a note of caution, saying that is, of course, to come, so that should not be prejudiced. And I spoke to a survivor here earlier on who said, you know, trial by social media should be avoided with any names in this report, because what it matters to the survivors is accountability. And finally, after so long, after 7 years, justice.
Yeah, I mean, both the Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister acknowledged in their statements that they had to be careful about what they said, because they don't want to prejudice any future proceedings. The Prime Minister saying that it's imperative there will be full accountability, that the government take in full its responsibility. And he talked, as I said, about the cladding, about speeding up cladding buildings in the short term, but also going through this report very carefully, looking at all the recommendations, and, in his words, making it a personal mission of his time as Prime Minister to right these wrongs. So the government talking there about what they want to do and what they intend to do, but there's a whole other side of this, which is potentially criminal proceedings. And for everyone involved, the government have to be very careful that they don't prejudice any future trials.
Beth, thank you. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, there summarising what the Prime Minister has had to say in the Commons today, and of course a response from the opposition leader. Beth, thank you. Well, if you are just joining us here on Sky News, we're live in central London today, where that final report into the Grenfell Tower fire has been released. It has concluded that the government was well aware of the deadly risks posed by combustible cladding and insulation a year before the fire, but the government failed to act on what it knew. The report has been published more than 7 years on from the fire that claimed 72 lives. Well, before we hear from the inquiry chair, let's take you through some of the key findings from the report published today. It highlights Systemic dishonesty by those who made and sold cladding and insulation products. The inquiry finding firms had manipulated tests and misled markets. The regulation of the construction and refurbishment of high-rise residential buildings has been branded seriously defective by the report, with the government accused of being complacent, defensive and dismissive on fire safety. The report highlights a conflict of interest between approved fire safety inspectors and those they were inspecting. And as we've been hearing, the report says that a year before the fire, the Conservative government was well aware of the risks posed by combustible cladding and insulation, but failed to act on what it knew. It finds that there was a breakdown in the relationship between the tenant management organisation and residents. Some residents regarding the TMO as an uncaring and bullying overlord that belittled and marginalised them. The biggest recommendation from today's report is for a single independent body to regulate construction products, certify contractors and accredit fire risk assessors. Well, let's hear now from some of the families of the Grenfell victims who are speaking now. Let's listen in.
And due to the majority of people that died, and has, in my opinion, perverted the course of justice and needs to be held accountable and has a lot to answer. This government did not consult us in any way, shape or form, did not take our views on whether we wanted this inquiry. This inquiry was forced on us. We had no say. We were not consulted. And like I say, to some it gives answers and to some it doesn't do anything except it's put that extra nail in the coffin, as they say, or in the heart. Words cannot describe the pain that I have gone through, the pain that my family has gone through with having this inquiry running parallel to the criminal investigation. Watching the inquiry, for me, has been very painful. I've seen witnesses laugh, giving evidence, which burns me inside. How they can have the cheek to do that, knowing that they are partially to blame for what happened on that horrific day. You have other witnesses that didn't even turn up and submitted their submissions through their solicitors, claiming that they were not well enough to give evidence, yet this was not followed through and checked to see if this was actually correct. You have companies like Arconic, which hid behind what's the word? Hid behind the law of their country to not give evidence. Again, the chairman has summoned this important person to give evidence, yet it just shows you how weak our law is and the benefits of this inquiry, what it does. I'm sorry to say, but it's been a joke. I don't know how much money has been spent on this inquiry. I think it's about 170 million. But had we have had that money to pursue our own private investigation from the government, I would have taken it with open hands to pursue our own private prosecution. And I still don't understand, why is it that the inquiry was opened on the very same day of the fire, or the next day? This is an abusement of power from the government. And the reason why the government has done this is because it knows that it is under criminal investigation itself. And in order to hide its findings or its responsibility to take the heat out of the situation, this is why the inquiry was opened, to prevent social disorder on London streets moving forward, and because it's under criminal investigation itself. And the problem is, nobody is able to hold this government accountable. And this will continue to happen because our laws are weak. That's all. I'm sorry if I didn't present myself in the appropriate way, but when you're emotional about something or overwhelmed, it's difficult to sum up how you feel at the time of the moment.
Thank you, Sam. I think you did very well. Thank you very much for speaking. I know it's difficult, but I guess what you're trying to say is that the morning after the fire, when you didn't even know what was going on and who was dead or alive from your family, an inquiry was opened, and assurances by Theresa May, and assurances were made that the inquiry would not get in the way of the investigation or the prosecutions. And I actually have an email, a letter, which I kept all the letters, you see, a letter signed by Alok Sharma and Nick Hurd, who were both ministers at the time, giving an assurance on 24th of June 2017 that the inquiry would not slow down prosecutions or get in the way of prosecutions or the investigation. I think it's very important to understand that when people are at their most vulnerable, governments should safeguard the victims' interests. Whether it was a knee-jerk reaction or whether it was deliberate, we don't know. But the consequence was that for 7 years, these families have had no closure, because closure means criminal investigations and prosecutions, and in particular sense of where there's been violent death, it's manslaughter charges. The problem is you have here is the Grenfell web of blame that's been talked about. And the inquiry spends a lot of time talking about all of these participants. And before I hand over to Shahrukh or Karim, depending who wants to talk about it, essentially what this has done has meant that the CPS will find it very hard to meet the bar of probable conviction. Now, we're not lawyers, but we do know how to go and ask the right questions. And what's happened is, what we've been told is that it is very difficult to charge for manslaughter where there is multiple defendants. And you all need to do your homework and go and talk to some barristers and prosecutors. That's what they should be talking about, but they're not. This basically rules out or makes it very difficult for prosecutions for manslaughter. But I think it's best if maybe Shahrukh can speak about that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming here today. I think I have a duty to the people who perished to say what I feel in my heart was the reality. And that began for us from June 2017. An inquiry was announced on a day that I was looking for my mom, basically going from hospital to hospital, trying to see which hospital she might be in. In no way we were informed of its beginning. We were consulted or, had know-how of what inquiry was or is. Don't get me wrong, the mammoth task that Sir Martin Moore Biggs took, and the task of, gathering and going through evidence that was mounting up day by day from, millions into, very quickly surpassing 120 million different documents to go through, was from very beginning telling me something is delaying justice. To me, I was looking at a tower and I was telling myself, all the evidence is before your eyes. And why these complications? Why this? And I think if somebody wanted to create a system that prevents justice occurring, you could not have designed a better system that is in place now. The system, I think the government knowingly derailed the justice that should have followed. And I think it would have been Attorney General's duty, plus the Crown prosecution. They should have ensured that such an inquiry does not become a barrier to holding the perpetrators of the crime and making him fully accountable. But I'm afraid that has happened. The task of the inquiry, the mammoth task as it was, going through all those documents of a titanic proportions, is not deniable. But the reality is, to me, I don't have justice, and any future prosecution that is foreseeable, I don't think is worth, even thinking about, because there's probably going to be some sort of minor charges with perpetrators getting away literally with murder. And that's the system we have in this country, where people in charge who fail their duties, who fail the watchdogs, who should have made sure that the security and the safety of the citizens are ensured, they're getting away with it. And that's the system we have. And I'm afraid because there is no prosecution, we have seen only in the month of August, 26th of August, something that was, I would call Grenfell 2, happened in East London. Thankfully, there was no fatality this time because the people had not stayed put. But if you look at the building, you can see that, it all burnt down, just like Grenfell. So 7 years on, people are living with this cladding. They're living in fear. So things has not changed. It's this illusion of learning from the mistakes have not brought about any concrete actions by the government in removal of those claddings. And I fear that is because there is no prosecution. There is no consequences for people who fail while they are in office. They can just go and ignore it. Ignore the public. There are thousands of buildings wrapped with cladding today. And with a government that we have that is not taking responsibility for taking them off, it shows that they don't fear any prosecution. If we had rightful prosecution in hand, these things won't happen. Just like it doesn't happen in North America. Well, it rarely happens in America because if things like this happen, the punitive action, the penalties are so severe that not only people, companies, corporations would go out of business, their directors would be held personally responsible. And I expect, the Crown prosecution now to tell us what sort of prosecution they're intending to have they have in mind. To me, it's a manslaughter charge, and nothing less would do. If they want to have a minor charge that leads to a small fine with suspended sentences, then I'll, bring it back to the country and tell the people this is the country and this is the system we have. And unless it's fixed, you're not safe in your own homes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was just asked by one of the reporters, this gentleman is Shahrukh Aghlani, who lost his mother and his aunt in the fire. He's campaigned very heavily, and his family have campaigned for the PEEPs, which is the personal evacuation.
Cable in a bit, Jake.
Because his mother was disabled and died in the fire. So,
Can I go to Karim now,
This
maybe?
tragedy. And Michael, we've just been watching some of the families affected, the next of kin, speaking in response to this report. On behalf of the families that you represent, what have they made of the findings in this final chapter?
Well, I think having listened, because they have, over the last few years, it's taken to accumulate the evidence. You know, in a sense, what was said today was the icing on the cake. We've been waiting for this, and there's an inevitability. The evidence spoke for itself. It was really highly critical in relation to all levels of governance. Really what the chair was saying today and the panel was saying is that the families have been let down at all levels. A sort of echo of infected blood, COVID, you name it, post office scandal. So it's a fundamental, in a sense, failure of the system. It's a systemic problem which this government's going to have to face. And I'm glad to hear they are adopting most of it already.
Well, Sir Keir Starmer in the House of Commons earlier on said, give us 6 months. We're going to look at this report and come back on the recommendations. There are 58 of them. Sir Keir Starmer did give a bit of concrete information, though. He said that those companies named in the report, the companies who the victims know well, only too well the names of, they've listened to the evidence as part of this inquiry, they will no longer be given government contracts, which is a concrete bit of action from the government immediately.
Yes, no, all of that is entirely welcomed. 6 months, I'm thinking, is a little bit long, but anyway, it's detailed stuff. So, but there are basic principles here. The fundamental one is that the families want is not only the criminal prosecution, but looking at where all these people who've been named are now. Are they still in the safety business? Are they still giving advice? So there needs to be a system of accreditation so that they're not allowed to go on and do the same work for somebody else. And also the companies themselves should be sanctioned. Fines are not enough. They can pay the fines. They shouldn't be allowed to do the work. They shouldn't be allowed to get the contract. So entirely approved.
Yeah, this is almost two-pronged action going forward. It's ensuring that this never happens again, and that's part of the recommendations. But it's also the accountability that the families all along have been very clear that is central to what they want to come from this. And contained in this report and all the evidence that's led up to this point is information that may well lead to prosecution. And the Prime Minister and the opposition leader in the House of Commons today said, everybody tread carefully because we don't want to prejudice any of that.
No,
How confident are the families you represent that they will see actual justice, see people go to prison for what happened to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not a question they can answer. How confident can anybody be? Because it will depend on the prosecuting authorities, their attitude to the evidence. I think a point that is made by the families is that, did it really have to wait this long? Because in the early days, you'd have a public inquiry and a police investigation and prosecution running alongside. You wouldn't wait for 7 years. Well, it's going to be more than 7 years. They're not announcing anything until 2027. That's 10 years. Too long.
What's the danger with it being delayed further? What's the family's fear? Because, you know, we talk about justice delayed is justice denied. They want to keep focus on this, but it's hard, isn't it? Because the final report has come up now. It's almost that the impetus is on their shoulders to keep the momentum going, if you like, which is just not fair, not right.
No, I think one tends to forget how traumatic it was for them. It was traumatic for everybody else because, I don't know about yourself, but I remember the night because I watched it. One of the few things, a living, real-time catastrophe you watch on your own screens. And the Italian family who I represent, one of the Italian families, a young woman, architect, 23, Gloria Trevisan. She was on the phone to her mother in Italy, and they were watching it on television. I mean, just imagine, for them, this is a really terrible moment. And they're another group were saying, you know, at the end of the day, we do want real accountability and we don't want it prejudiced, obviously. So I think it's moved on. It's a lot for them to bear to keep the flame alive, but they'll do that because in one sense it keeps hope alive.
There is so much more to come from these families. Today is by no means the final chapter,
no.
The line under things. This is just more information to arm them to go forward with this continued fight. But something else that will be coming in the coming months is the memorial to the site that we see here. And that has featured heavily when you to families about the fact that, yes, they want accountability, but they want Grenfell to be remembered so it doesn't happen again, because it is the thoughts of what happened in that tower that night that should remain central to any recommendations, any overhaul of regulation, any form of practice.
Well, that's why the chair read out all the names today. And I think it's a problem for the relatives, friends, neighbours and people in the vicinity. Some think, do we want a physical, memorial of where people died? And maybe, in a sense, they're still in the tower. Then there's another group of people who think, well, it's necessary to remind us to have the real thing there. So I think it's another burden for them to work out what's the best memorial. I think the best memorial is not necessarily a place or a building, but is actually a legacy. If we can change the way our society works, particularly get away from a political background to this event was basically fire safety. It gets in the way of progress and profit and all the rest of it.
Commercial interests over public safety.
Exactly, and that's the lesson, I think. Along with the duty of candour, which came out of Hillsborough, and a lot of other basic principles known as the Nolan principles have got to be put into operation so that we have better values underpinning our democracy.
In the build-up to this report, it was called the blame game, finger-pointing, different organisations and people passing the buck. The report calls it dishonesty, and that was at the heart of what happened in the build-up to it.
There is a theme that runs all the way through it. There's a theme of incompetence, a theme of indifference, a theme of contempt.
Marginalising that community, not listening to it.
In other words, the community, and certainly the families I represent, particularly one who was the chair of the Residents' Leasehold Association, he worked tirelessly, 25 years, to get the local council to recognise that Grenfell Tower is a social housing project which was neglected, and that his overtures to get change were dismissed. He even forecast exactly what happened. He sent a letter to the local council. We called it, in the inquiry, the Inferno letter. He exactly described what happened on the night, and he wasn't listened to. And he's still saying tenants, a change that should happen, should be, residents should be, families should be empowered to bring about change within the environment they live in. In other words, given a voice and given a management role.
Do you think things will change from this point on? Seize the impetus of today, if you like, because when we talk about Grenfell Tower, it is a tragedy of huge proportions, the likes we hope we'll never see again. But across the UK right now, tenants are in substandard conditions. We talk tirelessly here on Sky News about social housing, people living in mould, water coming through their ceilings. The Tenants Association not listening to them, the local councils ignoring them. Is this the moment that gives those people hope? Because, from this point on, I know that the victims, the families, the community, they want to push forward and be the voice for the working class who are, quite frankly, living in squalor.
Yes, and that is, he didn't describe it in those terms, but one of the panel members brought in for phase 2. He is a specialist in social housing and housing associations, and that he put his finger on that. It's a form of social discrimination that goes on, that, if you're living in those kind of places, the actual conditions in which you live deteriorate and they're not attended to and you're ignored because they're thinking, oh, well, you're lucky to have a house anyway. That sort of approach. And that came up time and again in this inquiry, in both phases, particularly the TMO and their attitude to the tenants and the complaints that they made. That's all being reformed, and I'm hoping that the message, it takes a long time. You can't have a revolution quite like that, but you can have an ongoing change of environment. And I just hope that what Keir Starmer said today, he sticks to, so he keeps the momentum. Otherwise, I'm sure the families will be there to monitor what's going on, because that's the other thing. You get recommendations out of an inquest, out of an inquiry. What happens to them? You know, they evaporate. They're not acted on. And so there isn't a recommendation about that, other than they should be recorded so you and I know what's been recommended and who said they're not going to do anything. And in fact, it would have been interesting if the chair had considered, maybe he did, to defer the ending of the inquiry in order to find out what potential governments might do. But I can see why you might not do that, because it adds another year.
More time.
But it's important to ensure, implementation and enforcement, which is why the idea of sanctions is extremely important against those people who have violated the law, because it may be less than a criminal offence, but they may be unfit for purpose.
Michael Asford, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much, representing a number of the families involved. I hope they have taken some hope and solace from today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Well, if you're just joining us, we are live in central London this afternoon. That final report into the Grenfell Tower fire was released earlier on today. It has concluded that the government was well aware of the deadly risks posed by combustible cladding and insulation a year before the fire, but failed to act on what it knew. Well, the report was published more than 7 years on from the fire that claimed 72 lives. Before we hear from the inquiry chair, let's take you through some of the key findings from today's report. Well, the report highlights systemic dishonesty by those who made and sold cladding, panels and insulation products. The inquiry found firms had manipulated tests and misled markets. The regulation of the construction and refurbishment of high-rise residential buildings is branded seriously defective by this report, with the government accused of being complacent, defensive and dismissive on fire safety. The report highlights a conflict of interest between approved fire safety inspectors and those they were inspecting. And as we've been hearing, the report says that a year before the fire, the Conservative government was well aware of the risks posed by cladding and insulation, but failed to act on the information it had. Well, it finds there was a breakdown in the relationship between the tenant management organisation and the residents. Some residents regarding the TMO as an uncaring and bullying overlord that belittled and marginalised them. The biggest recommendation from today's report is for a single independent body to regulate